Is anybody still on?
Yes.
Welcome back.
All right.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, it was on my end. I guess it needed an update. Really stupid. Let's see if I got, okay. What was he talking about? Really, yeah, the Taiping Rebellion. Let me bring up my slides again. Oh, there they still are. Still there. Hold on. I got to bring them back up. Open. Trying to remember which one it was. Okay, yeah. All right. What we see here with Hong Xiuquan, and as you hear his, within that documentary, I'm sure he was either, was probably fluent in Chinese or Cantonese. You can hear this inflection of different tones, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class semester, how you hear his, I don't know, the tones pretty much there with, we mentioned when he says Xiuquan, and it probably was down and up. So he did a really good job with that. But again, a part of this different, other than not Han Chinese, but really the influences coming from the West, but most particularly the impact of what Protestant Christianity and the missionaries had, as you see here. It would have a profound, rather violent impact internally with China. You hear what he said was beginning what could have been considered the need for reform, at least what the Qing government was trying to do. So this would become, they would just devastate China internally. And much can be said about Nanjing, because if Beijing or Peking or the emperor, the Forbidden Palace, and I hope everybody's heard what the Forbidden Palace is. That's where the emperor, Chinese emperor was. Nobody was really allowed in there other than whoever was supposed to work there. If Peking at the time, I guess it was pronounced, where the emperor was politically and for the Manchu Qing government, from there, since 1644, Nanjing can be considered the spiritual of China. Hello? Okay.
Sorry, my niece is in the room.
No problem. So really, that's why they would make their way up to Nanjing, because really, and you'll see it later, because Sun Yat-sen would try to, the nationalist government would try to center, well, their capital would be Nanjing after the 1911 revolution. Okay. Really, as you see, they moved through here and they just devastated, more likely scorched earth, a lot of destruction. So I don't want to, we've already talked about this last week. So really, again, so what are the takeaways here real quick? Here. So we see the impact of religion foreign to what China would have been with the Buddhism and Taoism. Of course, we do see the social impact of opium on the Chinese overall. Then of course, we could talk about regionally or as far as or imperial type of British Empire and within trade. But here we see the internal impact All right. And of course, one of the other continuing factors was impact on the military. Um, and again, the sense of reform. All right. Really, what would have happened? So they would be setting up their own little thing, all right, in Nanjing. From about the time, as you see here, headquartered eventually there in Nanjing, they had their own little sense of kingdom, the kingdom of heavenly peace. That was it. Set up their own kingdom, so to speak. It was more of the utopian type attempt to set up regards to, I guess you can I don't know if you really want to describe it as a cult, but maybe so, because of really from 1853 until finally it took them, the Qing government, 11 years to finally get things going, to get down there and kick them out or destroy them. And you see how they were able to do that only through the hiring, not the standing army of the Qing government, but hiring one of their generals to bring together his own mercenary units, I guess you could say, so to speak. All right. But at the end result was really, you can't do so much when you get to the point where you stick it around and you start to have your own internal followers start to attempt to seek their own power. So that's what happened in Nanjing as far as internally with this kingdom of heavenly peace. And then, of course, externally, as you heard, with intervention from the other global powers, so to speak, and putting down this kingdom somewhat. But of course, this really became to the point to, as I was able to get into last week, and one of the things that I mentioned, what could be called within the second half of the 19th century, the self-strengthening movement. And let me get to that real quick. I'm going to probably have to stop share again. My video's not on. Hey, all right. Okay, here I am. I'm back. Okay. Get to my slide. Self-strengthening movement was a point to where the Qing government would try to do a lot themselves. And okay, I'm almost there. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Okay. Share screen. It's a little tedious here on. Okay, you see this, right? I kind of got really starting at about the time that, as he mentioned, American Civil War, it was an attempt to modernize. Okay. But I will tell you what that means as far as for China. The best way to do that is compare it with Japan, because about around this time also was U.S. influence on Japan and their attempt to modernize. Okay, about this same time, really it became to the point of the end of the feudal system in Japan. Really taking a look at the samurai that were already kind of sort of on the way out. But again, just
go cash out right now because it's paying more.
Okay. I thought somebody had a question. All right. I'm talking about Japan, so we can compare it. Japan's ability to modernize was really in response to encroachment of the West, particularly the U.S. though. Okay. What they were able to do, you can see from the rest of U.S. history in regards to what will happen here. Well, U.S. with, of course, by mid part of the 20th century, of course, World War II. You saw the results of their modernization primarily with the military. Okay. But of course, they had their own concept of colonialism. They wind up getting down there into Taiwan, Manchuria, of course, in the latter part of the 20th century. And China here was doing about almost the same thing, but on their own to some aspects. But the results were different, okay, as compared to, or at least within Japan seemed to be able to modernize rather quickly. All right, of course, they had a lot of help, or they just, what it was, it contrasted with China and why. We'll get to see that here in a bit. Much of that, of course, here, first Sino-Japanese War, but 1895.
For Japan, wasn't it more forced modernization by the United States as well?
Yeah, version of their own most favored nation status with Japan. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Good question, by the way. Excellent question. But you see here, beginning after, about the time that they were trying to put down the Taiping Rebellion, the Kingdom of Heavenly Peace, you start to see some those more outspoken. Remember, I told you that really they saw the writing on the wall earlier, okay, down there with shortly after Lord McCartney showed up, and then Eliot and Lin Jishu, and much of the more ones that didn't really like the way the emperor was answering the memorials, responding to them, or not at all, in regards to the foreigners, right? Britain. Here we see the buildup of a concept of modernizing, manufacturing, and really direct involvement at first, 1861 to 1872. What caused them? Well, really what's going on here wasn't working, because whatever they produced, manufactured, were pretty faulty. And really was based on the fact that it wasn't just the Qing government, but the industries themselves, okay, in China internally. And so it was another tiered approach here, 1872, 1885. This time we'll try to mirror what maybe the West would probably do, step away for a second. But again, we start to see how they still want to, you remember, see the at arm's length kind of approach there. But at the same time, bring in what would be maybe considered a more involvement with, merchants, to get in there and try to do some. Remember, by this time, though, of course, much of pressure internally was the rise in the merchant class. Okay, much of you see that down there in the Canton. All right, I'm sure much before that, of course, as far as during the Qing dynasty. Much of this was based on, of course, still the Confucian aspects of where in the society merchants were. can imagine, well, where society foreigners were, Chinese society. So this is, here you see this continued, well, we got to do something. We're really messing things up. But by the time of the late 1880s, it just basically came to the point of perhaps seeing what Japan was able to do or being forced to do with military, okay? But other industries, primarily, of course, main form of transportation and communication with the telegraph, railroad, mostly railroad, and steam-powered ships, but mostly railroad. Really and that's what Japan was doing, okay? The railroad was perhaps where this difference between modernization with modern Asia came about, Japan and China. We got to understand that who is right there north of China, and actually had been with them for 100 years, few hundred years already. Then the Russians. The Russians would become part of this problem and involvement, particularly Manchuria, by 1895. Okay, but surprisingly or not, it wasn't just the Russians; it was also the Germans. Believe okay, before World War I. All right, so somehow or another, Korea got involved in all this. By the time, really by 1895, there were some issues between the two. What I would like to do is kind of, well, let me get to it first. This is, I think I may have, no, I don't have this out of order. Okay. All right. So what was going on? Well, of course, maybe historically within ancient Chinese history, there's always been some level of conflict between the two. All right, back and forth. But this is the modern part, though. This is when Japan became part of what they were trying to become part of the global community, but at the same time, influence from the U.S. Really, what the U.S. imperialism. But again, I don't know if I may have mentioned this before, and what was going on internally in Japan itself. By 1868, to begin to develop their own sense of government, went back and forth as far as a democratic process or not. Came to the point of having a constitution, but restoring the spiritual authority or ideological authority of the Japanese emperor. Okay, now the concept of the viewpoint of the Japanese emperor is very different than the Chinese emperor within this aspect. As you see, the unequal treaty system from impact on Japan from the U.S. Their own version of imperialism. And they're wanting to acquire the new land, mainly gaining that prestige, because it wasn't just the Chinese who were getting humiliated. As you see, the U.S. was imposing most favored nation status on them. Of course, a sense of humiliation. So you would want to the Japanese, very sensitive to saving face. All right. Saving face is much of that may deal with their own isolation that they had in the feudal system, Confucianism. They had their own state religion, mainly dealing with the emperor and that was Shintoism. I'll get into that a little bit later. That would come into play during World War II. But you see the encroachment on Japan now starting to want to go to Manchuria, right there north. That's where the Manchu came from. Some sort of indirect connection with the Mongol Empire, but much that part, of course, that's right between or somewhere in between Siberia and Korea, and of course China, upper part of China, but not too far from Beijing, up there in the northeast section. But they got into Korea 1895, and really what the crux of this war was in 1895 between Japan and China was Korea, to be honest. It was even involving the U.S. to some aspects. It was the end of the kingdom, imperial type, the chosen dynasty in Korea. Korea was just still a little bit behind, but they were already on their way to trying to modernize. Again, still it's very similar with China, trying to a sense of self-preservation, but they eventually fell. But they lost. Okay, so really I can get into this next week as far as we continue now closer into latter part of the 19th century. But as you see, the Chinese would lose this, and I tell you, this even would bring about the self-strengthening movement, or at least, excuse me, that was before, right? Okay, even with this almost most of the rest of the 19th century, after the Opium Wars, and still we lose to a power that after all this attempt to modernize, obviously there's a problem. Okay, there is a problem, and really had to do with what you see with the results of the Taiping Rebellion and internal strife, the unequal treaty system, encroachment of other Western powers, this time U.S., putting that pressure on Japan. Japan then trying to really, but they took it themselves. They really can't. It's a lot of influence from the West. Let's not get into this blame game. That's not what I'm here for. Peace, though. Well, greatly exacerbated the Chinese elite intellectuals, where already the current world affairs and politics. Of course, you're going to know all this if you really, after already nearly over 50, 75 years of foreign encroachment. Okay. What would come about initially with the young emperor didn't stick around too long. He attempted for a while to do some reforms, influenced from one of the more outspoken, interconnected kind of crony system within his advisors. To try something as far as reform. The young Chinese emperor. Okay, and he did this, and it only lasts for 100 days. Now, the article, I don't know if you guys read the article yet that I have in there in Blackboard. Did you guys read that? If you didn't yet, and you're working on your paper proposal, that's okay. Let's get it read by next week. There's an article in there about the 100 days reform. Talk a little bit about next week to some extent. But as you see, he did this on his own, but guess who was the one that really was in power? Okay, this really kind of brings to the fore the kind of dynamic inside the palace, because the empress, okay, dowager, so the actual old emperor, he retired. He he either died or retired and eventually died. So on paper, I guess it would be the young emperor here, but the ones that really ran the palace was the Empress Dowager Shishi. Okay, the mom. All right. Really was still sticking around because this was the emperor's, wife, first wife. But you remember, I don't know, we haven't really talked about concubines. No, we haven't. We haven't talked about concubines. I did in some aspects. I didn't really touch upon the Chinese family, touched upon, but I didn't touch upon aspects of marriage and childbirth, and of course the monarchy, at the palace. All right, and other than the first wife, the emperor still had, or many others had concubines. That would be the other young women snatched up in a lot of respect, almost literally snatched up from other places, and there'd be there and be several of them. This would have a lot of create the wow. There's your soap opera. There is your soap opera. If you get onto any Chinese drama, you'll start to see it back and forth. Central intrigue and espionage, or however you want to call it. But at this point, this Empress Dowager Shishi. She was making the call. The young emperor was able to do some stuff on his own without her knowing for a short while. Well, it took her, as you see, 100 days to find out. But once she found out that he was trying to do these type of reforms and essentially put Chinese society upside down, if it wasn't upside down already, she threw him in, put him under house arrest. As you see, who influenced him, the Guangxu emperor, and that's Kong Yue and Liang Qichao. Okay, the article will talk about them, and I appreciate if you guys go ahead and take a look at that for next week. Pictures here of them, of the two who influenced the young emperor here. 1898. Okay, so let me see what time we got. Okay, 6:30. Let me finish up with this. And so what did we talk about? We talked really quick. I'm going to take in like the second half of the 19th century and just kind of shrink it down real quick, with these main events, periods of time. Oh yeah. Okay, I almost forgot. Okay, so you see a chain of events here. All right, we see the Taiping Rebellion. If that wasn't enough, and the reforms and modernization didn't help out, okay, rather idealistic young emperor here, but really the beginning to see how I'm kind of skipping a little too far here. So let's just, if that wasn't enough, by 1898, 1899, here we go again. Okay, here we go again. Boxer Rebellion. Now, Conrad, you still there? Are you there, Conrad?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, all right.
And my voice is back.
Oh, good. All right. So really what next week can do, get into this, but what is the origins of these silly things? After already the total destruction of the Taiping Rebellion, We now have the Boxer Rebellion, and once again, influence of Western, Western influence or corruption, however you want to look at it. The Protestant missionaries, again, am I being critical? No, don't. Again, I'm not trying to put blame in right now, but you start to see how it impacted internally. But one of the things that we see here, though, is then where this started from. Now, the exact origins of the Boxer Rebellion, the very name, the Boxer, you sense that alluding to or now analogous to martial arts, but secret societies, and really whether or not it was in response initially to missionaries that were now deep inside the interior of China. One aspect that probably I never actually touched upon in regards to maybe origins of this is from the treaty ports, okay? The treaty ports. And the flow of information, the flow of people moving around, but flow of people in the interior, Chinese moving into these treaty ports were, especially after the Taiping Rebellion, going to find, it was basically surviving. Displacement, as I mentioned, of several tens or hundreds of millions, tens of millions of young Chinese men in Southeast Asia, Southeast China, they were mostly displaced. You can see that perhaps with this. After the Taiping Rebellion, a lot of movement to the treaty ports, valuable jobs or, working, but also, of course, immigration. All right, immigration out to to the U.S. All right. We got, of course, we got to understand that the one influence that perhaps that they had immigration towards to U.S. Of course, it was 1849 there in California with the gold rush. Yeah, they were already heading their way out. And of course, there was already a overseas Chinese community, specifically down there in the South Pacific, Vietnam, that Southeast Asia. They were already around there. With the aspects of the Taiping Rebellion, the self-strengthening movement, 1864, there was a treaty. I think it was called the Burlingame Treaty. And of course, I will again cheat. Okay, good old Wikipedia. I sense the silent judgment already. That's okay. So, 1868, between the actual treaty between the United States and Qing China, really it was these. I mentioned what was the Treaty of Tianjin? That ended the Second Opium War, 1856, an agreement between the powers in regards to extraterritoriality and more territory and opium. But this one really kind of did something good for the U.S., all right? Establishing friendly relations. The biggest concept here, though, is immigration. All right. And remember what I said regards to one of the weirdest stereotypes, or again, like I mentioned very beginning a few weeks ago, the Western perception was characterized or colored by these will be racial caricatures, but really it was a stereotype negative. The yellow peril, for example, of the initial immigration was the coolies. All right, that would be considered what characterizing Chinese immigration, particularly to the U.S. Initially, what was the coolie system? That was those who were almost to the point like indentured servants, or similar to the immigration from England to the American colonies, initial indentured servitude. So they would have to come over, but they would work for a certain amount of time to pay for their trip over. Okay. One of the things I haven't talked about is establishment. Much of the influence from the Canton system was the Chinese 6 companies. Okay. They're the ones that financed many of these Chinese men. And yes, they were hired to go to the US or immigrate wherever for the mining, but for the trains, or for the railroad in the US. 1869 was a transcontinental railroad right there in Promontory Point, Utah. Well, who built it? Okay. Well, it was the Chinese. Most of them were the Chinese. Okay. Or all. There might have been others. Okay. But mostly Chinese. That was a result. So the Burlingame Treaty, the immigration opened up. But now that was bestowed upon them with that caricature, it kind of stuck. But really was others coming over just because of the nowhere, there was nothing that was left for them. Their families were killed. So young Chinese men made their way through either Hong Kong or the treaty ports on their way over on their steamship to US, okay? And they weren't always hired to be, always having to coolies. That was the initial thing. Okay, later on within the 1870s, 1880s, they would be coming along on their own, even though their pressure to do so was pretty much similar at the beginning. What else? I think I'll stop it at that. I think I got to a point to where I wanted to describe how it's weird how you can describe something from a different direction as far as an origin point. And what we'll see here next week then will be the 100 Days Reforms, the Boxer Rebellion, and then getting very close, much closer to militarism, Sun Yat-sen, secret societies. The secret societies would come into play, overseas secret societies, excuse me, not the secret societies that started up in the Boxer Rebellion, okay? The Chinese 6 companies, Sun Yat-sen, his support, okay? Coming very close. Maybe next week we'll get into all that. So I want to kind of shift gears. And Justine, I don't think she ever showed back up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For next week, or is that when we're doing the presentations also?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I've got the presentations. I might take up most of the time next week. If that is so, well, I guess it'll be a really accelerated. I should give you all the time during class, the whole class period, to do that for you. Okay, to do that. So I really shouldn't encroach upon your time there. But let's go ahead and talk about your proposals and your presentation. I guess we can I can look at, I want to get them out to you so that you can kind of look at it. I know I got 2 groups and I got a couple in solos. But I'll try and get those out to you as quickly as I can over the weekend. Will it have an impact on how you do your presentation? Probably not. But I'm sure you would. The opportunity to have feedback from me, that'd probably be important to you, I imagine. So what are, I guess, what are y'all doing? So how close are we to the group thesis or individual thesis and presenting that? And I should talk about, I guess we can talk about or bring in how we are with the groups as far as each individual contribution. So White Lotus Rebellion, how you doing?
Well, me and Skylar just exchanged emails and
Is
what's her name?
Justine with you?
Justine, yeah, we don't have any information on her, so I was kind of hoping she was going to be here.
Okay, she was.